The following is a conversation with Dale Brunsvold, otherwise known as the voice of Rudolf Steiner. For the past 2 decades, Brunsvold has been a prolific creator of audiobook recordings which eloquently convey the absolutely titanic body of work created by the philosopher, esotericist, and founder of Waldorf education, Rudolf Steiner. This conversation was absolutely riveting, and we moved through a number of very deep and crucial ideas found within Steiner's thought. Be sure to leave the obligatory comment telling me that I sound like Terence McKenna, and enjoy.
What I did was start what was called RudolfSteinerAudio.com back in 2005.
Oh,
Yeah. And I started recording Steiner in 1980. So I had a lot of the basic books on cassettes that I would listen to in the car, that kind of thing. And then eventually when the internet came along, I happened to be in the right place at the right time, I guess. But then as the years went by, as the work grew, and I had permission from the public publishing houses, Rudolf Steiner Press then created a YouTube. Let's keep the story short, I guess. Created a YouTube site. So that is above and beyond me, as it were, using that work because that's the agreement we have. And so, and then I do a Podbean site as well. People liked the fact that the streaming was easier to control. You could speed it up, slow it down, and all that stuff. So I relented and put it on rudolfsteiner.podbean.com as well. It's very hard to find stuff on there. The most searchable site still of all those sites, as far as I'm concerned, is my original main site, rudolfsteineraudio.com. So anyway, so I recommend that as the way to go, except you're just downloading MP3s then. It doesn't stream. Okay.
right.
That's that story.
Cool. So, yeah, so I recently watched your or listened to the interview that you did with the Hermetics podcast, and I got to say that was great. You know, hearing you just be able to kind of really dive into things that you find interesting about Steiner, and so yeah, I wanted to try and kind of delve into that a bit and just kind of see, you know, if we could kind of bounce some ideas back and forth, I suppose. So I've been kind of, I'd say, dabbling in Steiner's work for a good while now, a few years. And of course, prior to that, philosophy has been kind of my thing, really, just, you know, since I was like 15 years old. And so, you know, with my work, I draw inspiration from a lot of different sources and kind of just try to synthesize things together into kind of a coherent vision, which is also, I'd say, a pretty good description of what Steiner was doing as well in a lot of ways. But anyway, so one particular line of thought that I've been pursuing lately has been Johann von Goethe and his color theory and his metamorphosis of plants, and in particular the way that Steiner saw Goethe's naturalism as being like the key to unlock the universe, basically. Like he saw Goethe as Goethe's methodology as really allowing us to kind of see through the appearances, as it were, and into what Steiner would describe as the spiritual world. And so I guess that would be a good starting place for really talking, kind of getting into really Steiner's whole thing here, is how that factored into his methodology and how it kind of differentiates him from other mystics or theologians or that kind of thing.
Well, I could mention some things, but I'd want you to correct me because it's been a while. I read those things a long time ago. There's a nice book to contrast with Goethe's his book, that Theory of Knowledge Implicit in Goethe's World Conception, right? Which is, I think, the book you're referencing, which is a book. He wrote that back in the 1890s, I think. Is also a set of lectures from, I believe, 1920. The introduction is by Saul Bellow, the Nobel laureate, who was also a studier of Steiner, called Boundaries of Natural Science, The Boundaries of Natural Science.
Oh yes, I listened to at
Okay.
least part of your recordings of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what's interesting in there is he shows how our thinking has sort of gotten carried away with itself. And we posit certain non-experienceable concepts, and then we apply them to our phenomenological world that we are experiencing. And he's kind of describing in there how we run these people that do this, they rush past what's immediately in front of them and concoct essentially a whole story that is unfounded phenomenologically. Not to say it's true or false, not to say the models aren't incredibly useful. You know, atoms and molecules and all this stuff, in a certain sense, we have an amazing world because of them. But he's saying we should realize we're not experiencing this directly. And this is something Goethe, right, was very true to. And to say he went past the appearance, as you describe it, is a little paradoxical because, in one sense, you could say that Goethe actually stays with the appearance more honestly, patiently, earnestly than, let's say, even modern science might do. Otherwise being wrapped up in its experiments and everything. And what he wanted to do is find a place in his inner experience of this stuff. So what he called it, if you remember this phrase, he called his desire to experience nature as something he called sensorially exact fantasy, right?
Yeah.
So he wanted to actually educate his subjectivity into an objective state.
Right. And so that's it.
Right.
And so if we kind of contrast what Goethe's doing with like Newton's corpuscular theory, right?
Right.
So
Right.
Newton, he's trying to make sense of light and color. And so because he's within that kind of early British empiricist tradition, there's this presumption there that the real things underlying the appearances must be like physical objects with properties like mass and weight and extended surfaces, things like that. So he's like, oh, it must be
Nice.
made out of
Yeah.
these little BBs of some sort that we don't actually see. They're
Right.
not actually there. And there's something really appropriate about that too, because I think that with Newton in particular, the way that he's trying to make sense of light and gravity too. He's like at the very precipice of what will prove to be kind of the boundary that physicalistic science can't really cross. But for that very reason, like if light's made out of BBs, then you kind of by definition are never going to see those BBs because then, there would have to be like a super light to reveal that, as it were, right? So Steiner has this very beautiful metaphor. He says, or illustration rather, he says, if you can imagine yourself in a completely empty space and there's like a light or a star or something behind you and the light is moving past, you wouldn't actually be able to see the light if the light doesn't have anything to illuminate because the light in itself is not visible. And so anyway, that it was Newton's inability to make sense of that, which is really gesturing towards the fact that he was missing something. I would say he was missing what was really going on. And Steiner definitely saw that missing piece in Goethe. So I described it a minute ago as seeing through the like sensory physical manifestations of things. And I think that what I'm kind of trying to get at there is very different than what Newton's trying to do. Newton's taking this mental image of the light corpuscle or BB or
Yeah.
whatever, and he's like, I think I've described it as unsensible sensations. So he's taking a mental image of a sensory phenomena and like pretending that it's there, even though it's like by definition outside of our sensory faculties. But what Goethe is doing, Goethe, he says, look not beyond the phenomena for a theory. The phenomena themselves are the theory. And so it seems to me what
Nice.
he's saying by that is that if you just take the phenomena themselves and really look at how they interlock with one another and how they create one another and all that, then that pattern that reveals itself is the underlying reality. Like that the orphenomen of light and darkness and color, that's the real objective reality, which reveals itself not to be a bunch of little BBs, but rather a kind of spiritual archetype, as it were, which underlies things. And so I think that's why Steiner saw that as very foundational epistemologically to his whole project, because he's going to take that and it seems like, and this is kind of me speculating in a way, because I'm much less familiar with his whole body of work, so maybe you could correct me a bit, but it seems like the big move that Steiner makes in moving from Goethe into his own project is that he says, okay, let's take that lens, that way of approaching nature, and let's turn it back around, so that we're now not just looking at the world and looking at that in this kind of archetypal, phenomenological kind of way, but we're actually looking at the inner contents of our own experience that way. And that's what bridges us into these capacities for knowing higher worlds, as he says.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of looking at it. I mean, we don't know, in a way, I don't anyway. I should say I don't know. What was the karmic gifts that Steiner brought into this incarnation that gave him, I think, probably an extraordinary inner life to begin with, right? As we know from you guys talking about the vision of his aunt dying, and him speaking about elementals, when he was quite young, although he wasn't, extremely aware until later of what he was experiencing, shared it with people. They were a little freaked out, so he shut up until he was older. But yeah, I mean, the thing that I find interesting, of course, Goethe hit a wall, even in his own way, because what? Well, I don't know how related to the spiritual he necessarily was. I don't know enough about it. By the way, I did record the entire, the first two parts of Goethe's theory of color. I don't know if you know that. They were asked.
I don't. No, I don't think I've listened to that.
Yeah.
No, I've
Yeah.
read a bit of it, but no, I wasn't aware that you did a recording of it. But
So go ahead. There's a download of it on the rudolfsteineraudio.com site. That's the only place it is. But a group in Canada were making a theory of color website and wrote me 15 years ago or whatever to record it. And I loved it. It was wonderful to read, really stunning, actually, as you clearly appreciate as well. And so in Steiner, for me, just to kind of say, well, where did Steiner then go beyond and yet not beyond, because he stayed true to Goethe's methodology? I think he did. Okay. And that was to visit then the picture of the human being that anthroposophy claims is just matter-of-factly true. Now, I don't have the phenomenological experience of what he says. He does. Steiner to me is not, never, to me, Steiner, as far as I know, unless he clearly states that he's doing so, he doesn't make up anything. He doesn't think up anything. What he's doing is taking phenomenological experience from all of his organs of perception. That's a big phrase, right? Mm-hmm. The organs of perception in his astral body, the organs of perception in his etheric body. They all have organs of perception in them. See, the organs of perception, of course, our physical body, and the organs of perception of our ego. And the organ of perception of our ego is thinking. Thinking is the seeing that the ego does, right? And so once a human being has that wonderful, astonishing panorama of sense experience, try to even imagine that. And then how many years do you have to baby walk through that until you start to make these connections with the life of thought, which Steiner says the only part of our experience that travels through the highest realms. Thinking is the thing that kind of allows us to do that, where he can talk about what seraphim are doing, not because he thinks it up, but because he unites with them in intuitive consciousness and experiences their experience, and then works very hard through his wonderful scientific training to conceptualize it for us so we can start to have these wonderful ponderings that are so staggering, So anyway, and so I think that whole thing was a Goethean methodology, even though he had, a lot more sense experience to grapple with. Is that a fair description to you?
Right. Yeah, I think that's definitely accurate. And Goethe, I think you're right. I think he did kind of reach a wall in his own way. And I think part of that was so he was acquaintances with the philosophers Hegel and Schelling, but he always wanted to kind of differentiate himself from them because he was like, oh, you guys are just getting lost in your own heads. I want to actually
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
in the world. And so I think for that reason, whereas Hegel, um, maybe he was getting lost in his own abstractions in a way, but he was really trying to turn inward. I think Goethe was trying to be like, well, okay, that's Hegel's thing. I'm going to go out here and, actually look at color and flowers and things like that. And so maybe you could see Steiner as kind of like bringing those streams together in a way that's kind of in the same way that Plato brings together like Heraclitus and Parmenides, something like that.
Oh,
Um,
cool.
Right, but anyway, so what you said about the seraphim and all that though, so that's interesting to me, because I've talked to a few people within the anthroposophy world, and there are definitely a lot of people who like really seem to get it, and those people are just like the most brilliant people I've come across. But there is, I think, a bit of a misconception among certain fans of anthroposophy, at least, where there's this idea, and it's never really stated out loud, but it's like, well, Steiner had this like magical power where he could just like close his eyes and fly off into a different universe and see these things, then bring them back down here. Um, but I mean, if we're going to believe Steiner that he really is staying true to this phenomenological methodology, start to finish, then when he calls what he's doing spiritual science, I mean, I think we should take his word for it that that is really what he means. He really is doing something that he believes all people can do.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily something where, of course, a lot of people are into like psychedelics now and that kind of thing. And they have this idea that the spiritual world is something that we encounter through these um, like substance induced altered states of consciousness or something like that, which is not necessarily to say that those things are necessarily bad, in my opinion. But I think what Steiner's doing is something very different here. Like when he goes through these different stages of world evolution, right? You've got Saturn and Sun and Moon and Earth and future Jupiter and all that. What seems to be going on here, and I am just kind of speculating, but I think what's going on is something like this. He's really just kind of shutting down the different kind of layers of his own consciousness in a way where he's kind of like, because he's thinking of it as this kind of how should I put this? Like our consciousness unfolds throughout the process of like our like biological development, right? Like we're in the womb and then we're born and then we develop these different aspects of ourselves. So he says that like we develop the etheric body between the ages of 1 and 7, right? And then it's the astral body until age 14 and so forth. So he's seeing this kind of process of different aspects of human consciousness developing over time. But they all remain present. They're all there. And so what I think he's doing is he's trying to sink down into the lowest level of that and then work his way back up, as it were. And as he's doing that, he's taking note of exactly what's happening, and that's how he's building his cosmology. That's why he's saying, okay, Saturn was a body of pure warmth. I mean, what does that sound like, right? That sounds to me at least like the uterine state prior to birth, right? And because he thinks that the overall pattern here that we see within human consciousness, which at least in principle is available to us all the time, contains the whole universe. And so that's why he's calling this science. He's not speculating really. He's not making things up. He believes that these are the very patterns that we see when we know how to look.
Sure. Yeah. Well said. Yeah, that's really true. I mean, there's lots of ways that he tries to describe the method of research that he's doing, in spiritual realms. And one of them is interesting, and that is our life of memory. You'll probably recall this as I mentioned it. And again, refine what I say if I get a little sloppy. I do get sloppy sometimes. I get too excited.
Oh, so do I.
If we go back to a certain place in our memory, and that's where our memory begins, 2.5, maybe 1.5 to 3, whatever it is, where we seem to have our first memories. And Steiner says that when you get to that place, there's a wall there, and a clairvoyant can learn, or whatever type of person is, maybe it's more an initiate, to go through that, over that threshold, and still experience a life of memory. But it's not your own life anymore.
The Akasha. Yeah.
It could be the Akasha, it could be your past lives in the life of memory that still has an existence somewhere, somehow there. And in that world, once you can maneuver in it, again, like a baby has to learn how to walk, right? I mean, this was an enormous amount of work, I think, in so many ways for anybody that does that. And anyway, other things that then you can research moon evolution. Then you can research these evolutions. That's one part of it. The other part of it, when you talk about the womb needing that as a picture for Saturn, we also carry Saturn right now, you and I, where? In us, in our warmth body. Mm-hmm. Our warmth body is literally Saturn present in us. Okay, that's interesting, right? I mean, yeah. So, and our etheric body, I guess you could say, I don't know, you'd go to our etheric body came about on sun, our astral body came about on moon. So these things are present in us. But again, we're exhausting our consciousness existentially in the processing of our physical sense organ data, right? We're using our physical sense organs are what our consciousness is really, really connected to right now, right? And so we work so hard at doing that so that our day-to-day life doesn't go insane.
Right. It keeps us
right.
alive.
It keeps us alive and everything. And it's just like the stars are there. You look up, you can't see them. Why? Well, the sun is so bright in its illumination that it covers up the presence of the stars. Our relationship of our consciousness to our physical sense organs, in a way, covers up the information that our astral organs want to give us and our etheric organs want to give us. It's there, even though it might be quite chaotic given the type of consciousness we would try to bring to it. A linear, sequential, logical consciousness might not be the right one, right? It might be, like he says, you've got to hold those images in your meditations until you have control of them, until you can hold one image and it will not waver, it will not go into some other image or anything. Well, that's incredibly difficult because we're so passive. We're habituated to our physical senses. It's a very relaxing thing at the same time that I'm saying we're exhausting our consciousness in it. It's also our life. And so we're comfortable in it. And what he's asking of us, claiming that is needed, he's not even asking it of us. He's, as a scientist, saying this is what's required of you, is to make your consciousness way more active than it is right now. And you know what? I don't think any of us are very good at that, to be for some reason. And I'm speaking really broadly there. I am not very good at that. Let's say that. You know what I mean?
And this is a thing with the power of like direct conceptualization. Like everybody can think in terms of like, just kind of talking silently in their own heads. But to really like go kind of a step further and really conceptualize I've argued that this is actually a very recent development in human history, right? Because if you go back like to the ancient Greeks or the ancient Sumerians or whatever, really until I'm not sure where to put the line. I think the Renaissance was a really important dividing line here. But anyway,
sure.
The further back you go, the less individual human creativity you find. It's like you had myths, but like those were not novels. Like no individual person like came up with that. It was with Greek mythology, like Homer didn't make any of that up. They were originally oral traditions And so they developed, you could say, in this kind of collective way where it's really these beings within the Hellenistic collective unconscious that were really forming these myths, not so much human egos, right? And the same with like music and that kind of thing. But as we kind of move more towards the present, we see this process whereby individual human creativity is becoming more and more pronounced. Like the first novels came into being in, I believe it was the 18th century, where you first started to see these kind of like love story type novels that were very popular in France and that kind of thing. And today it's just nothing for a random person to be like, oh, you know what, I'm going to write a fantasy novel because why not? And that's something that we can do because, or at least some of us, where we can really just sit down and engage in like just raw conceptualization in a way that is mundane to us. A lot of us anyway. Some people look at creative people like they're unicorns and they're like, I have no idea how you do that. But for more creative people, we're just like, oh, I'm just doing the thing. And so I think what Steiner's saying here is this is a capacity that's developing over time, and I think it's directly related to what he's talking about for these kind of higher faculties of knowledge, because we have to get underneath language, as it were, or above it, maybe is a better way of putting that, into this more purely conceptual realm. And by doing that, that kind of unlocks these creative capacities whereby a person can just sit down and create their own mythology, like Tolkien or George R. R. Martin or whatever the case. But if we're using that not just to create fantasy, but we're actually looking at that as that imaginal faculty as something of epistemological significance,
Hmm.
then that's when we can start to kind of break through to the other side, as it were, and really like look at the stars and start seeing what they're trying to tell us, as it were. So anyway, that was a very long rant. So let me kind of try to end this on something I can kind of pass back to you. Um, so with the way that Steiner thinks of these things, he's got his whole history as well with these different phases of civilization. And let's see. So I believe it begins with like the Indian civilization, and then it's like Egypto-Chaldean and so forth, moving into the present. Um, so how would Steiner describe like the current thing that we're moving through?
Yeah. Yeah, let's go back to what you were saying and just bring that in, I guess, other things that he talks about. So the evolution
Yeah.
of consciousness, right, to me is
Mhm.
maybe the greatest, most beautiful, most profound concept that Steiner has really brought the world. Just think about that. I mean, nobody's ever thought that before. It just destroyed my whole love of history in so many ways, because we take our modality of consciousness, right? The consciousness soul era, intellectual soul era. We're kind of in the mix of those two right now, right? And we just posit it automatically back into the past.
Right.
Right? Oh, yeah, these people sat around and figured out how to make the pyramid. They had their piece of paper out there, and you know what I mean? And yeah, sure, that's how it worked. And I always say to people when I bring it up and they look at me like I'm nuts, I go, well, we accept evolution. We say everything around us is undergoing constant change.
But we don't
And
really
you're going
believe
to,
it. We think
well,
everything.
maybe,
Yeah.
okay, maybe we do. But the point being is if they accept that, they
Right.
then say, well, no, but consciousness has been the same all along. And I go,
Right. Yeah.
well, that's just nuts. That's got to have evolved as well. Not that I have. So if we go back to those times when we had this sort of hive-like experience of each other,
Hmm.
and so what was consciousness? Well, Steiner, right, describes consciousness as a constant revelation pouring into us from the spiritual beings.
Hmm.
And we lived in an intelligence that was quite extraordinary, right? I mean, you even look at bees or ants or whatever, you're seeing extraordinary intelligences anyway. Just imagine ours far higher than that, right? And again, no real individual experience of it, but probably a glorious, bliss-filled, unified experience of it together, right? On the other hand, it was also coercive. So when you had these thoughts, they moved you along with everybody else in the ways that they did. So no freedom, but astonishing wisdom. And the exception in this relationship were the initiates. The initiates had gone ahead, and in their development were very much like, shall we say, we are now. But they still had obviously some kind of connection to this older form of consciousness. So they were the great guides, right? They were the great guides of civilization. So, okay, so we imagine them, let's say in the Indian epoch, and they have a form of consciousness. And in that form of consciousness, especially then, they really had a deep experience of the spiritual world. It was constant. They yearned for it all the time. Steiner describes that they really didn't even like the physical world, right?
Samsara.
So, right. But in that, they had religion. They created a religion. Well, did they make this religion up? Did they mythologize their experience? No, they did not. I'm going to say this, right? They did not. It was a direct, complete experience that got created into ritual and whatever else they had. And then as consciousness continued to evolve, right, that religion then stayed, let's say, the same, and it had to become oral. And then from the oral, it had to become, let's say, written down or codified, and eventually became an institutionalized religion. Mm-hmm. Now, that's true every single time. In Persia, the next one, we have Zarathustrianism, which was probably a direct experience of the spiritual world of a different kind because consciousness was different. And that became oral and then written and then traditionalized and institutionalized, right? So all of these, all the way up, have had this decaying, this decadent aspect, you could say. Why? Because consciousness, as it evolved, left them behind. But in another beautiful way that was so healing for me, they're all absolutely correct as well. Mm-hmm. If I could just go back to that modality of consciousness, I go, well, of course, that's how you see the spiritual world. Of course, this is correct, right? And we're going, oh, look at those people. They thought things were this way. You know what I mean? In this sad, conceited, arrogant, astonishingly narrow-minded way we see the world now. I mean, it's comical. Once you compare it to Steiner's cosmology, it's horrifyingly comical, right? How conceited we are in our breathtaking ignorance and arrogance, right? Which are unfortunately brother and sister in the end of the world. Mm-hmm. Arrogance and ignorance. So anyway, so then we get to the time, as you described in 1413, roughly, when we get to this form of consciousness we have now. Right, the consciousness soul begins. What's happened? Well, the higher worlds have receded. And instead of the living experience happening through our etheric body of the spiritual presence that we experienced in our, call it thinking, it was something else. Now we only get their experience reflected through our physical brain. And because it's reflected through our physical brain, it isn't the presence of spiritual beings anymore existentially. It's only the image of them or their activity, right? And because it's only an image, just like when I look in a mirror. I look in a mirror, I'm not controlled by my reflection in the mirror, right?
And so this is, and it's right around that time where like that's just leading up to the Renaissance, and that's where you get this birth of perspectivity in art, right? Where
isn't that something?
Direct experience becomes so significant. Yeah.
So anyway, so that, and all of this to me, now, and again, you say we have to take Steiner and believe him. I don't believe Steiner. I don't do anything with Steiner. It's like when I read Einstein. Well, yeah, I understand the theory of relativity. Well, no, I don't. Do you know I don't? You got to know the mathematics all the way down to the bottom. I don't know that. Do I believe Einstein? Well, no, I don't believe Einstein. I ponder those ideas. I live as working hypotheses with an astonishing knowledge. That's what I do with Steiner. I ponder the possibility. What's so delicious about Steiner is he says, you know, the conceptual life is quite, it can't make up something that doesn't exist in the world. You can't make up another color. There's 7 main colors. You can't come up with another one. right? So how do I come up with the activity and the details of the lives of spiritual beings? You can't do it conceptually. What do you have to have first? As he says, observation comes before thinking. Always, even in the spiritual world. So the delicious aspect of Steiner is that he has a direct, we're arguing, has a direct perceptual experience of these beings, and then works up a concept for us to entertain. And I'm stunned. I'm stunned by the concepts I experience in him. I go, wow, even the evolution of consciousness, it just isn't there unless you can perceive it, right?
But then
So
once you can see it,
go ahead.
present, right? Like,
Well, in a way, I want to be cautious about it. Yes, I think so. I think in many ways my life has been changed. Why? Because he said, take those working hypotheses and let them exist in your life and see what happens in your life. See how your life changes. If it doesn't work, you'll cast them aside, just like you would anything else, right? And so, yeah, I think that that's the beauty of him, right? And also when he calls it science, everybody can do it. Well, what I love is he says, so when I say it's science, it's like mathematics is a science. So if I look at a proof of the Pythagorean theorem, there's no physical world that's allowing me to become certain of the theorem that shows me that the square on the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares on the sides, right?
mhm.
And yet, when I work through that proof through thinking, through a very clear, objective, not a subjective, but an objective thinking, I know it's true. But I don't have anything in the physical world that supports that. That is a conceptual thing that is absolute. And what's beautiful is it's more certain than any perception I have in the world. Every perception, I look at that tree outside and I go, well, I'm going to go over to this side of it. Oh my God, it's a completely different tree now. I'm going to go to the north side of it. Oh my God, that's a completely different tree. So even my perception, Steiner even says, right, perception is what is subjective in the human being. It's thinking, which is objective. We
Right.
all share a life. That blows a lot of people away, right? It's
And
without,
so here's
think about that. I'm rambling myself. I'll shut up now. Go ahead.
Oh, you're good. We're both getting too excited. Okay, so what Goethe's doing then, contrast what he's doing with the Pythagoreans, right? The Pythagoreans that are really the Greeks in general did not think that the natural world was really of epistemological significance at all. It's
Oh,
a little
wow.
bit different with Aristotle. He's kind of an outlier in that regard, but for the most part, they were like, no, 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 no. It's just you go into your head, you get to the realm of the forms. This is just appearance. This is just Maya. But what Goethe's doing is he's like bringing those two together now because then he's saying, no, 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 like colors and these plant morphologies and stuff. And he's applying that same kind of thing that the Pythagoreans are doing, where you're taking the raw concept itself and kind of unfolding it in this kind of procedural way. Goethe is doing the same thing, but the concepts, rather than just using like points and numbers and lines, he's using concepts that he's seeing as in the world, right? Like that
Fair
he's
enough.
not seeing
Yeah.
like for example, like he has his like yellow and blue polarities, right? Yellow is light through darkness and blue is darkness through light. And he's saying, well, those are conceptual contents, not just of my mind, but of the world itself. They're out there, right? But anyway, one other thing I wanted to touch upon before I forget about it is you were talking about how within like the Indian epoch, there was this receptivity to these kind of spiritual hierarchies that has gone away, or at least has become significantly diminished over time. And so I've been doing a lot of research for one of my next videos I'm working on pertaining to ancient shamanic practices. And if you look at like Paleolithic cave arts, Aboriginal cave art, that kind of thing, one common motif that you see around the world is this. I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, maybe, but the therianthropes, I think it's what it's called. It's like animal human hybrids. And so you'll have these
Oh,
depictions of humans transforming into animals or animals transforming into humans. You see something very similar in Mesoamerican art, the motif of like the human being, the human head coming out of the animal head is a recurrent theme in like Aztec and Mayan stuff. And so what I think is going on here is this. During these different stages of consciousness evolution, what's happening is that within each stage, a new boundary is forming, right? Because what's really happening here is the human ego is developing, the human soul is kind of manifesting itself in the like imminent human body. And so, in order to do so, it has to go through these different layers. And with each layer, it like creates a membrane, as it were, because you need that in order for there to be a kind of felt distinction between inner and outer, right?
yeah, nice.
Um, and so when we go back to this like Paleolithic era, which let's say I think the things that we're seeing there would correspond to maybe the Atlantean eras, like the people from the Lemurian who were still Lemurians, but in the Atlantean
Hmm.
epoch, I think something like that is how Steiner would describe it. But anyway, during that phase, what's happening here, I think, is the human ego is still like within the etheric body primarily. Like that's where the sense of selfhood is because at this stage, it's still like this very tribalistic kind of collective ego. It's not yet fully individualized yet. And that's not going to happen until it begins to move up into the astral, where we're going to begin to get a sense of the individual human personality as kind of a form in itself, which can be kind of abstracted from the tribe, the group, the family, the nation, that kind of thing. So what that would then imply is that within that kind of etheric, magical mode of collective selfhood, that astral layer is still wide open. The membrane isn't there yet. And so within that realm, Steiner says the etheric connects us with the plants, the astral connects us with the world of animals, right? And so what are shamans all about? They're all about connecting with these animal spirits and allowing the animal spirits to actually come in and transform human consciousness. And it seems to me that's exactly what's going on. That's exactly what we're seeing depicted here is that the because the astral body of the human being is not yet an astral ego, it's still just a radio that can freely tune into that kind of thing. And that's exactly what they were doing. So anyway, so as we then move through these subsequent stages of development, it's like new membrane, new membrane, new membrane until we finally get to what I think is kind of the crux of all this. And at this point, I'm kind of speaking for myself more than for Steiner, maybe, but we can see how it kind of interlocks with what he has to say. Is you get to the point where, well, let me back up a little bit. You go through the I think what Steiner would call the intellectual soul, right, which is really about language. So if you go back into the really mythical era, human beings did not really feel like the voices in their heads were coming from an ego. We always see it described as like the voices of the ancestors, the voices of the gods, and it's
Yeah,
during that
yeah.
phase that the membrane kind of forms around our inner voice, basically. And so
Okay.
then the next stage, which I think Steiner would describe as the what's the second one? He's got three souls, right? It's intellectual and then something and then conscious.
Actually, the first one's ascension soul, then the
Sentient.
intellectual
Okay.
soul, and then the consciousness soul. Yeah.
Okay, so it would actually be the intellectual and his thing, but well, either way, we'll get to that. But anyway, what I think is going on here is this that once we get to this kind of crux, what's happening is pure subjectivity itself for the first time comes to be enveloped by that kind of membrane. And so what happens here is you get this idea of the human being experiencing itself as being experience, which sounds kind of topsy-turvy, but if you look at the way that people in the modern world describe their existence, like what are you? they'll probably say like, well, I'm my consciousness. I am that which experiences the world. I am that space within which all the subjectivity happens, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah, nice.
you don't see this until very recently in history. You go back earlier than the Renaissance, like Plato would have never said, "I am consciousness." That was barely even a concept for the Greeks. He had a very sophisticated kind of how should I say anatomy of the human being with the nous and the logos and thymos and all that. But this idea that that consciousness is something in us that kind of looks out at the world that's not really there until very recently in history. And so I think what I would say is that that's kind of the crux, because that's actually the bridge between the ego. So up to this point, it's been creating these kind of membranes around the different subtle bodies. And as it moves through that kind of bottleneck of just pure awareness itself, which is when we begin to think that the world is just mere matter, right? Because we think the subjectivity is just locked in our own heads. We can actually experience the world that way for the first time. But as we move through that, then that's when we're not in the world of the bodies anymore, even the subtle bodies. Now we're moving into something that is like purely spiritual, purely conceptual.
Wow. Yeah, that's
So that's
interesting.
that's my narrative anyway.
Yeah.
It's a little bit different than Steiner's for sure, but
Well, but I see a lot of Steiner's basic ideas really forming your thought life. I mean, if I could say that, I don't mean to say you're not unoriginal at all, but I can feel the evolution of consciousness in the background of what you're saying, which is really cool. I
oh,
love
no, I
that,
mean, this is why I was drawn
Yeah.
to Steiner, is
Yeah,
because
yeah, I
I
see.
felt
I
like
see.
he was
Yeah.
saying very similar things to what I had
Yeah.
been kind of devising on my own. But yeah, go
Yeah.
ahead. Sorry to cut you off.
No, no, no. Yeah. I mean, I guess let's look at the present. So in the unfolding of the human being, that's a mirror of, and I'm trying to remember exactly. Steiner, I think, is saying in the Indian, see, I may get it wrong. I think it was the Indian epoch when the etheric body of the human being was sort of reaching a maturation that was similar to what we see in the child from 1 to 7, right? And then in the Persian, the astral, what we see then in the human being from 1 7 to 14. But I might have these slightly off, so I don't want to press it. But there is a connection between the unfolding of the child, the phylogeny, and the ontogeny of the whole human race, even though in our case, it's all happening in a materialistic context. And in that prior case, the spiritual world was all really interacting with it far more than kind of can now. But in our time, so what happens? So when we get to the coming of age at 21, so that's the first time when you now have a complete physical body, a grown-up etheric body, a grown-up astral body, and the ego incarnates into this context, right? And they call it coming of age at 21.
Mhm.
Steiner then describes from 21 to 28. Well, what happens? If you recall this, the ego immediately starts working on the astral body, and it tries to transform it into something
So it's moving
eternal
it up.
and
Yeah.
noble, right?
Mhm.
And that's called the sentient soul period of the human being. And we're kind of unfolding microcosmically our own sentient soul life then through interaction with others, through our working into the world now with our careers or whatever we're doing, possibly college and postgraduate school. We're interacting with the world at a much higher independent level than we did before when we were still with our parents and all that stuff. So then from 28 to 35, the ego has done what it can in that incarnation with the karma it has and everything on the astral body. Or maybe it still does it. I'm not sure if it gives it up, right? But it dives down into the etheric body
Mhm.
and it tries to transform the etheric body. And that's the intellectual soul age of the human being from 28 to 30. You remember this typology before? Have you heard this before?
Right. So okay. So in the intellectual soul, yeah. I get what you're saying. So the 21 to 27 would correspond to the age of the intellectual soul,
No, to
correct?
the sentient soul, the
Sentient.
sentient
Okay.
soul
And then after that,
related to the astral body. Yeah.
right.
And
Okay.
then the ego in the etheric body. Well, the etheric body is the where the roots of our thinking life are exist. That's where the power of thinking, shall we say, arises out of the human being. Before those forces built our body, once they had built our body, they were emancipated and became the life of thinking. It's kind of interesting, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
kind of wild. That's kind of wild. Okay. And when you're in that modality from 35 to 42, that intellectual soul life, well, if you look at the average human being, that's when their life of thinking, their intellectual power is at its height. It's plateaued, you might say then, and we have that. And then from 42 to wait, I get these wrong, 21 to 28, okay, 28 to 35, then from 35 to 42, sorry. The ego actually tries to transform the physical body. So it meets what? Well, in a way, I like this myself, but I'm not saying Steiner really says this, but it meets death.
Mm-hmm.
So from 35 to 42, you have this midlife crisis. You have this experience of mortality, and your presence on the physical plane very existentially occurs, right? And we call it the consciousness soul, which is what the whole age is in now. We're in the consciousness soul age, and during that time period, your consciousness soul as an individual is also unfolding. So anyway, I wanted to bring that up. But another thing that's you mentioned before that's interesting is, we have these changes of consciousness that occur. Well, when you're born, that's an enormous thing. Your
Right.
physical body emancipates itself from the mother, but your etheric body and your astral body are still connected to the etheric body and the astral body of your mother, even then, right? But during that time, your consciousness changes massively from the time you're in the womb, obviously. Why? Because of a physical change. Then for those 7 years, your etheric body is developing. It's replacing all the substances of your physical body that your parents gave you. And finally, the last thing it gets rid of are the milk teeth, which are the hardest substance left in your body from your parents. And now you've moved your physical body away from your parents. Your etheric body unsheathes and is freed, right? And that is, again, a physiological transformation that changes consciousness. So the child's consciousness changes, Steiner argues, into something that's called pictorial moral. It's deeply, deeply living in story and myth. And they powerful teaching tools in Waldorf schools and stuff. That's what they try to do there, is change knowledge into something that meets the child's consciousness as it is, rather than I'm going to teach you linear, sequential, logical, factoidal information, and pulling the child out of that consciousness. Okay.
Right.
So then we have another 7-year period. These are all 7-year periods, but which, by the way, is when all the substances in your physical body are being replaced every 7 years, roughly. So you're now in a third physical body by now, which is kind of wild. Again, a physiological thing happens called puberty. And when puberty happens, you get into formal operations thinking, linear, sequential, logical thinking. Scholasticism kind of emerges in the human being, right? And that's because of something that happened physiologically to you that transforms your consciousness. Well, Steiner says if you were to go all the way back to the Indian epoch, you would find out that those physiological transformations continue all the way up into a person when they're into their 50s. Every 7 years, they would have a massive transformation of consciousness out of physiological changes.
And so the whole life cycle, or at least the majority of it, was being dedicated to that same process that in us only takes 7 years, right?
No, in our time, so he's saying that as the epochs went on, the physiological influence on consciousness lessened. So that in the Persian, it only lasted to, let's say, I'm guessing, 45. And in the Egyptian, it only lasted until, by the time you got to the fourth epoch and the mystery of Golgotha, it would only last until 30 years old, which interestingly is when the Christ incarnates in Jesus of Nazareth, right? Mm-hmm. And in our time, after about 27 years old, our physiological processes do not affect our consciousness anymore in that same way. So if we're going to continue with our spiritual development, which used to be given to us in a certain sense by our organism, even up into our 50s, isn't that wild? We have to take it on consciously. We have to take our own spiritual development on. Otherwise, we'll stay 27 for the rest of our lives.
Right.
Sound sound familiar?
Oh, yes, it does. And 27, this is, I use the word bottleneck before to describe this point where it's like you're really thinking of yourself as a pure subjectivity. And I think this is exactly that 27 mark is where that really fully comes to
Yeah.
form for human beings, and that is traumatizing for people because
Ah,
it creates this immense anxiety of like, oh gosh, like I am just this awareness of some sort that's just kind of here in a body for some reason in this world, and I've just been, thrown into this. Heidegger uses that thrownness in his
right,
early
right.
work. And because you can think of it as contraction, like I talked about membranes, right? You can think of it as like, in a sense, we're getting smaller in a way. Like if you feel like you are
Yeah,
your etheric
yeah.
body, and your etheric body is interconnected with your whole family and tribe, like you're big in a sense. You
You're
feel
big.
connected with the world. And then as it goes into kind of the astral, then you get this kind of individualized sense of yourself as something independent. But, the etheric's still there. Like, okay, you're an individual, but who cares? Whatever. The gods are everywhere. But as it continues to move up, it's like it's shrinking as it goes up until finally you're just this little pinprick, right? So Descartes, for example, he says that the soul is in the pineal gland because at that stage, which again, that's that kind of Renaissance period, right? We begin experiencing ourselves as just being this tiny infinitesimal point of consciousness that's somewhere looking out into the world from behind our eyeballs. And when that really comes to solidify, which I think that's when it happens, about 27 years old, is that's a really rough time for people. People talk about the 27 Club and the Saturn return. I mean, that's what that is, right? Because this anxiety intensifies to such an extreme point that for a lot of people, it's very difficult to deal with. And like you said, some people just get stuck there because they develop coping mechanisms that can allow them to deal with that, and those coping mechanisms then solidify, and that's pretty much the end of their development. So but yeah, and again, I'm kind of mix and matching my own ideas with Steiner's here, but you can see what I mean by they do seem to
Sure, sure.
interlock pretty well, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, the idea is that, I mean, if you extrapolate this argument or this picture Steiner has, there's going to come a time when we won't reach puberty.
Yeah, because we're getting younger, as he says.
That's as he says, right? So that's kind of wild. So what that's going to look like, right?
And
We don't
that's
reach puberty. What's that mean? There's no more breeding in the way that we understand all that now, right? Et cetera, right? Yeah, go ahead. I interrupted. Sorry.
I don't know. I'm talking too much, but I'll say this at least. When he talks about us getting younger, that's such an interesting idea to me because first of all, this is evidently something that you can just see within our own lifetimes. I was looking at
Hmm.
this article that was getting passed around, a couple of months ago or whatever, and it was these photos of actors from the 70s and 80s, like people from TV shows and movies and stuff. And the article was like, how old do you think these people are? And I'm just looking like, oh, early 40s, something like that. And it was like, oh, okay, so here's how old they actually were. And these people were in their like early to mid 20s, like all of them. And I was
Wow.
just thinking like, okay, so I'm 32, I'm a millennial, and I'm just looking around like, I don't know anybody who looks that old. We all look young. And this is why all the older generations keep thinking that we're still teenagers or something, because we look younger. Like you can literally
Hmm.
see it. And so what
Okay.
I've thought about this, and of course that's not the case for everybody, but it does seem to be a
Yeah.
trend
Okay.
from what I can see, is that the retention of how should I say this? The retention of youth is the retention of a kind of plasticity. Because in order to continue evolving, plasticity kind of has to be maintained in a way. Once you solidify it's done. It's over. And so what's happening here, I think, so you've probably heard, and this is definitely something you see in Steiner stuff, though. I don't know if he ever puts it this way, but I believe it was Ernest Haeckel, the biologist, who coined this. I think it's called the ontogenetic principle, that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. So we're reiterating the processes that have happened in the past. And so I'm like, all right, so if, as we move further into the future, there is just more stuff that has to be recapitulated. There's more phases that have to be gone through in order to get back to the starting point, because we all start from the same place, right? And so what seems to be happening here is that we're retaining, we're prolonging the plasticity of adolescence for longer, because there's more stages of recapitulation that we have to go through.
Yep, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I also imagine that plasticity is becoming less related to the physical organism and more related to our life of thinking and our consciousness being, I don't know, fostered. The idea is that you take on your spiritual development yourself consciously. If you don't, I don't care how young you look, you're going to be an old person calcified in your soul. Let's say that. Okay. So there's that side too. Yeah, if you become dogmatic and you lose the ability to take on new ideas, to whatever, meditate. I mean, I don't even mean that. That might be part of it, but right. So what does it even mean, let's say, to truly take on your own spiritual development after your body no longer is going to help anymore?
Mm-hmm.
You might stay young looking a long time and not have done anything. And for all we know, I don't know. I'd have to think about whether or not the spiritual development would keep you young looking, or make no difference at all, or you look older. I don't.
Yeah,
Or
I
is
have
that
no
too
idea.
generalized already? It's so fun. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so but yeah, that's interesting though, because it's like again, I keep on thinking of this metaphor of the bottleneck, right? Because it's like after we pass through that, that's when it's like, the training wheels are off. The rest of the process of our evolution has to be guided by the ego, because in a sense at that point the ego is kind of complete. Or I keep on using this term ego because I'm not sure, and Steiner does use that word often, or he'll just say I, right?
right.
The sense of selfhood is what I'm referring
Yeah.
to here. The sense of individualization is kind of complete, I would think, at that stage, in the sense that it's like it's not going to contract anymore. It can't become more thoroughly um,
Mm.
uh, individualized or localized into the human mind. And so this is kind of like the Jungian like individuation cycle, right? You've got this process of separation and differentiation, and you're going through all the harrowing stuff. And then as it turns
That's
back
good.
around, then you've got to reintegrate. And so what seems to be going on here, as from what I'm seeing, is that with Steiner, you're seeing the exact same thing. That once you pass that threshold, and the training wheels are off. It's that reintegrating process has to be directed by you. Obi-Wan Kenobi is dead, right? Like you've passed into the second act, as it were.
Well, that's fun. That's a very fun idea there. How do you say your name again? Keegan or
Keelan.
Keelan's? I'm sorry.
Yes. Yeah.
So I see, just for fun, I see that let's say a person just kind of goes with the flow. And at that time, their ego is complete, let's say that, and they're moving forward, and they don't take stock, shall we say, of the full picture, and can fall prey to going one way or the other. Because this ego that you have isn't really you. My ego that I have isn't really me. It's the ego that we built here in this karmic situation in this lifetime.
It's a
And through
reflection of the
through
soul.
right
Yeah.
of the higher self that never really does incarnate. It's radiating into this body and it's connected to it. But the goal, the hope, the grace is that that ego, in a certain sense, can wake up to the presence of its true self, right? But if it doesn't, let's say it doesn't, it just goes forward engrossed in its life. and we have the temptations of Lucifer and Ahriman. So this ego can get so pumped up by, let's say, really exploring, well, a lot of things. It could be, but let's just say the spiritual world from a very one-sided point of view and enlarge itself artificially into this super great, amazing thing that just doesn't find the physical world very interesting at all and really just wants to be part of the spiritual world, really knows that it is, and yet knows it in a very one-sided way. This is the thing, right? And so you get this, I want to take off the planet. I don't want to be part of this. I don't want to reincarnate again. God, what a horrible experience. You know what I mean? And you get this Luciferic temptation from the one side.
Right.
That's saying that my ego is who I really am. Okay, that's where the falsehood is. That's good. That's where I want to go. I'm going to say that, yeah, it is me, Dale. Yeah, it is me, Kean, but it isn't me too, right? And the other one is that I just find the physical world so real. The ego itself, we're really animals. I mean, we really are. And this ego thing is a real problem. I got to get rid of it. I need to figure out how to get rid of it, that kind of thing, and stay here in this animal sense, unite with the earth, the physical earth, and kind of go our way that way and separate off from spiritual evolution itself completely. Right? Until we're just, yeah, and we all live on a kind of a big, giant, dead cinder block, kind of is the picture, right? And it's all probably not, the egos are now just part of a, whatever it'll be, some kind of thing. So between those two, you have, in Steiner's cosmology, right, the I am that came to the earth through Christ. And the I am that came to the earth through Christ is keeping us connected to our real selves, which in a way, ironically, is the Christ as well, right? So what does that look like, right? And yet Ahriman and Lucifer are not something to be thrown away. They're not something to disregard. They're not something to shun. But now through this Christic center that you live in and acknowledge and understand yourself in context to, in relation to, they give us beauty. What does Lucifer give us? Beauty, freedom. There's amazing life that he gives us. Ahriman, severe, intense intellectuality, intelligence, working into the world that isn't sentimental and fantastical, but clear and precise. So these things are important in existence, right? Blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, so I wanted to bring that up. I just play around with that because, in the East, and I don't think it's as true. And you mentioned it, and I agreed with it at the same time that I think that the Buddhism and stuff has changed. I think it has changed in our modern time. But there was a time when the ego, the self, was just thought to be an aberration. And it was because of the body of desire that was locking us onto the earth and forcing us into these damn reincarnations, right? And that whole thing. And I thought one day, I was just sitting there one day thinking, yeah, I see the Buddha before Christ, again, 600 years before Christ, kind of seeing the wheel of becoming, right? The wheel of becoming, we got to liberate ourselves from this wheel of becoming. And I thought, it's too bad that he couldn't just turn himself just a little bit like this and see that behind what he thought was a wheel was a spiral of unfolding evolutionary consciousness. Because that's really what was there. Isn't that kind of wild? And I'm not saying, and the Buddha at his level of development and at that time was absolutely correct because the Christ wasn't here yet. And so everything that was happening was sort of unfolding out of the forces of the spiritual world that were still carrying us into the future. And by the time the Christ came, those forces were exhausted. There was nothing that was going to carry us forward. If the Christ hadn't come, Steiner says, the relationship between human being and human being would have started to become an infinite chasm that could not be bridged by one human being next to it. There would have been no way for you and I to have this conversation right now.
Right. And because what happens here is once that, so that I think this is pointing exactly to what I was saying about this idea of us beginning to experience ourselves as experientiality itself, as subjectivity itself. But what happens is, again, it like contracts into a little point. And that opens up this possibility, then, this very dangerous possibility of thinking, oh, okay, well, everything is just subjective. Words, it's all just social constructs, man, and everything is just preconditioned by culture. And you get this very like hyper anti-realist kind of postmodern view. And if you take that to its extreme, and I think you see this in Nietzsche as well. And actually, that's another thing that we should maybe come back to is Steiner and Nietzsche. But anyway, you end up with this thing where it's like the world itself just becomes completely incomprehensible. Like other human beings, like we're just these tiny little BBs that can never touch. It starts to seem like that membrane is just completely inviolable. And you see the iterations of this in Kant, right? Because Kant, he divides the phenomenal realm, the world of that which is experienced, from the noumenal. And he says, well, we can't get to the noumenal. The noumenal is just forever beyond us because everything will always be conditioned by our consciousness. Kant was hinging that whole thing on the idea that there were these structures that were just rock solid, that never changed, that had to be the same for everybody. And so Kant's compromise, the way I've put it, is he was saying, okay, we're all locked in these tiny little prisons, but we're all locked in the same kind of prison, so it's okay. But once you start thinking of this in more evolutionary terms, that consciousness is actually changing over time, then that doesn't really work either. You've somehow got to move beyond that. And I think that's exactly what Steiner is saying here, that without that, without the Christ, without the realization that there is this underlying logos, which actually does weave together all I amness into a unity, even though we're individualized and separated, then that's what you end up with. You end up with this completely just like an acid of just this anti-realist kind of relativism. And like you said, it just becomes this completely unbridgeable chasm between subjectivities.
Okay. There's a fascinating, you can still hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. There's a fascinating picture Steiner gives of this that I found recently that I've always been thinking about. But he's talking about the existence of the world and saying, we realize from many metaphysicians as well as his clairvoyance that every object, every physical thing on the earth has a spiritual archetypal counterpart. So that really this has, every blade of grass, every individual tree has a spiritual counterpart in the spiritual world. And of course, those are always fluctuating and changing, just like the objects in the world are. He says, you look at that and you see that true about the whole world, except for one thing. There's one thing on the earth that does not have a spiritual archetype. Have you ever heard this before?
I have not, actually. I am teeming with anticipation.
Okay.
Lay it on me.
And he says, and that is the mystery of Golgotha.
Interesting.
Yeah. The mystery of Golgotha happened here.
Okay.
So he then says, so there's many people who say, well, why do I have to worry about having any relationship to the Christ? And I'm not talking about religion here at all, right? I'm talking about this existential knowing, understanding, blah, 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 of the evolution of consciousness, of the unfolding of humanity's story, and the importance of Christ in that story, regardless of religions. I'm not into that at all, frankly, okay? He says, they say, well, I don't care. I'm a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Mohammedan or whatever, so I don't worry about that stuff. Or an atheist. I don't care about it. Doesn't matter. And if it's true, well, when I die, I'll meet the Christ and it'll all be okay, right? There's a certain logic in that, isn't there, right? There's a certain kind of logic in it. And Steiner says, that's not true. That's actually false. Because the mystery of Golgotha has no spiritual counterpart in the heavens. It has to be met. And he uses the word understand, not believe, not any of that kind of jargon, but it needs to be met and understood while in an incarnation. And while you're incarnated and you understand, no matter if you could be a Buddhist and a Hinduist, whatever, an atheist even, but you need to understand. That atheist would be a tough one, wouldn't it? To be you need to understand it, and then the time between lives will have a fruitfulness that it will not otherwise have if you don't have that relationship found on the earth. Isn't that fascinating? That's a wild one.
That is
Yeah,
fascinating. And there's
yeah,
like, I feel like there's something like this is the paradox of Christianity, right? Like the idea of the ultimate uh manifesting as just like this, dirty vagabond nailed dying to a piece of wood, as I've put it. It's just the
yeah,
most
yeah.
paradoxical thing
Yes.
imaginable. And so how do I want to go about this? So if we start with this kind of Platonic idea of the world, the spiritual world as a world of pure eternal forms. And then you can kind of get this idea of, okay, well, there's the world of appearance and the world of forms, and the world of appearance just kind of trickles down out of that. But then, like, things start to get weird if you start asking awkward questions. So, for example, I can say, okay, a circle, that's a Platonic form. It's up there in the Platonic heaven somewhere hanging out. Okay, well, what about a circle with a line through it? Okay, I mean that's a possibility. That is a possible permutation of things. So okay, sure, that's in the Platonic heaven too. Okay, what about two lines through it? What about three lines? What about 1,000? Like, and so you can start to say, well, okay, if there's a Platonic form of, I don't know, horses, is there a Platonic form of Jeffrey the horse? Why not? Like at what level of specificity is it supposed to like begin or end, right? And you can start thinking like, wait a minute. It like how, it does it starts to seem like everything is somehow kind of a mirror image of the divine in a way. And so there's this weird kind of like paradoxical topsy-turviness here. And so I'm looking at that. I'm literally thinking through this as I'm talking, so bear with me.
Okay. All right.
But
Sure.
so you look at that, and then you look at this idea of like the Christ event, the mystery of Golgotha. Um, what you seem to have there is like it. I want to call it an archetype or something, but again, that language kind of fails here because any kind of language that you would use to describe something transcendent kind of doesn't apply. You can't really call it a form or an archetype or something because it's like there's something about it which is necessarily manifest, where it's only, it can't just be real as a possibility. It like in order for it to exist at all, it's like it let me put it this way. It's like the form, the very possibility itself necessitates its own manifestation somehow. Like you cannot have it just as a spiritual archetype. Something like that. I'm just trying to unpack what you said, so help me out here.
Well, that's also another side of it, and that's an excellent point. And that is that in many of the religions of the past, you have the enactment, right? The enactment of something that lives in the unconscious. Let's look at it Jungianly, right? In the collective unconscious of humanity that is waiting for its birth on the physical plane.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the Adonis myth, you have the Osiris myths. We call them myths, but at that time something was being seen. We're arguing, if to keep myself consistent here, that there was a seeing of something, and these were all Christ stories, all of them. Steiner says. Now we go, Steiner, or Christianity took all these old stories and put them in. It's the opposite, Steiner says, right? This was finally the historical realization of something that was bubbling up in humanity for countless millennia, because it knew that there was going to be this time to come when all the forces of the spiritual will be exhausted. And without the coming of new spiritual forces, there would be no possibility of humanity evolving. It would be impossible. And that's why he calls the mystery of Golgotha the meaning of the earth, which is such a bizarre phrase. It is the meaning of the earth.
The meaning of
Oh, he's just a Christian. No, it has nothing to do with these, frankly, mostly horrifying forms of Christianity we have now that just really are frightening me, because to me, they're just using the name of the Lord in vain beyond any possibility that I ever thought was possible, right? And going all the way back to just looking at this one thing, forgetting all the institutions that have grown up over time, right? And trying to understand this picture that a phenomenologist Seeing the world as Steiner sees it describes this happening that occurred, right? I hope I didn't offend anybody who's listening. My apologies if I did.
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah,
They're
yeah,
used to
it's
me
all right.
offending
Yeah.
everybody already on my channel, so they'll be
So,
fine. They got tough skin. I
yeah.
made sure of that. But anyway, um, so where was I going? Oh, yes. Okay, so this reminds me of Teilhard de Chardin, right? Because his idea of this omega point, which for him, the omega point, it kind of is the Christ. It is, or it is the, he calls it like the transcendental object at the end of time, right? Or maybe you could say it's the second coming. I don't know, but anyway, you've got this idea here that you've got this possibility that is not yet realized that is a condition for the possibility of everything that has already happened. And that is so backwards in comparison to the way that we would think of things if we're looking at it in this very materialistic way. We're like, okay, you have cause, then effect. But this way that Chardin is looking at it, and I think you've got something pretty similar going on here with Steiner, is that there are certain possibilities where even if they haven't yet been realized, they are conditioning this kind of flow towards their realization, as it were. And I think
Yeah.
that's kind of what he's getting at here with Golgotha, is that it's kind of like the axis of time in a way, because it's like all of the past kind of flowed into that. And I like what you said there about the different myths that seem to kind of prefigure Christianity, right? So you'll hear this a lot from guys who want to be like, oh, well, the Christian myth is just cobbled together from, Dionysus and Osiris and this other thing. But again, if you stop looking at it like individual people were coming up with this stuff, then you start
Right.
to see it kind of being the exact opposite way. Like, no, 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 no. These were prefigurings, like dreamlike intimations of something that was to come. And so, speaking of that, what is to come, another thing I wanted to get at here was something you said earlier about the let's say the bringing into communion of the ego with the higher self or the soul, right? How exactly does that have to occur is what I'm wondering, because like it seems like there's something monumental there that has to happen in order for that to
Nice.
really take place. Like I can sit here and I can say it like, oh yeah, I know all about my soul and it's different from my ego. Like, I mean, I hear hippies say this kind of thing all the time, and it's like, oh well, do you really? Like, I mean, it feels like if you're gonna really have that realization, like where is like like for that to be real, it has to like tear you asunder. And so, what is that, and why does it seem like that's got to be something that demands so much of it? And why? Let me ask it one other way before I shut up. Why does it seem like it's so easy to say that, and why is there this huge gulf between being able to say it and actually like getting it? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Welcome to my world, man. I got to stop though for Chardin because I'm a big fan and I love this story. If I may share it and people get a kick out if they haven't heard it before, and I know you know this, and again, fill in the blanks, is this wonderful story where he is in China. He's been pretty much exiled by the church. They won't allow him to publish any of his theological work while he's alive. Okay. And here is he's studying the layers of the earth. Right? He's studying the layers of the earth, which apparently there's really nice places to do that in China. And he finds, as a paleontologist, he finds a certain fern. And he looks a million years later in the layers and he sees that this one fern has tangentially differentiated into all these other phyla, if I'm using the right words, right? And wow, he sees that that's connected to all these different ones. Then he goes another million years and finds that each one of those has tangentially manifested all these different phyla. And he comes to this phenomenological hypothesis, and okay, that during this time, evolution spent its passion the tangential differentiation of form.
Yeah, it's fanning out.
With unbelievable power, he says. It just shocked him after a while to see how intense this was. So he's watching this, layers of the earth, watching this keep going, just maddening, nutsy energy. And all of a sudden, he comes to a layer of the earth where from then on, for all intents and purposes, this tangential differentiation stops. There's vestiges of it, but nothing like it was before. And he goes, and it is at this layer of evolution, the later tertiary period, where for the first time in geological paleontological history, you find the remains of the human form. And he says this in this wonderful scientist/priest statement. He says, it's as though evolution in its intelligence had finally arrived what it had desired all along. And instead of spending its passion further in tangential differentiation, it began to radially converge all of its forces into the human form. And from then on, humanity, for good or ill, no hubris intended, no pride intended, humanity is the forces of evolution. So then we now have what happens? So a psychic space. So we go from cosmogenesis, as he calls it, to anthropogenesis. And now humanity has got this new space, this new psychic space that evolution has sort of graduated to, right? And the form stays the way it is, but now inwardly, all this tangential differentiation, you might say, is occurring internally in the psychic space of humanity called thinking. We are creating forms in our minds all the time, the eternal forms of Plato, etc., right? So then you get that, you evolve that space, that psychic space, to a certain level where the Christ can incarnate into it, and you get Christogenesis.
Right. And so you've got this fanning out, which is creating diversity. And then once it arrives at where it's going, then it turns in the other way and it begins to kind of contract in a way. It starts to prune away the things that aren't needed anymore. And that's exactly what we see. And Chardin talks about this in the fossil record, right? He talks about how, like with every other species, you see this branching out into different forms. But once the human arrives there, it's like you see the exact opposite. It zeroes in on this, and all the other forms, all the other variations of the human form get kind of left behind because it's like they're not needed anymore. It's kind of like if you were, trying to make something, and so you just kind of like throw out all of your parts on the table, and then you're like, oh, okay, I see the big picture now, so I don't need this anymore, so I'm going to throw it away. So anyway, you've got this development of what Chardin would call the noosphere now, and what that would imply, if it's following the same logic, is right now we're going through. Oh, actually, maybe I should back this up. I think I'm skipping a step. So you get that fanning out of the mental world that allows for the incarnation of the Christ, and then that incarnation of the Christ then allows for the I amness to really take hold in the individual human beings, and then you get another fanning out, which is individual human creativity, which is I think what we're seeing right now. Again, we don't have really, well, we do have collective myths kind of, but when we look around at pop culture right now. Almost everything is the creative products of individual human imagination. And so it's like we're going through a Cambrian explosion of the imagination right now. You can say.
Wow, nice.
Yeah, right. Nice. And what that would then imply is that we're going to reach another point where that fanning out has completed. And then that's going to contract into something because we have arrived at what we were looking for.
The only difference might be is that now, I think, especially in the consciousness soul era, these developmental points you're talking about are not determined by a homogeneous evolution anymore. They're determined by us. And here's one that just dawned on me. I hope I'm wrong, but we might argue that the modern mythology isn't mental anymore; it's physical, and we would call it technology. We might be able to call our modern mythology literally the world of technology, that we're it's just coming up all around us and whoa, right? But let's go back now to spiritual development. So what about the lower self called Dale getting haunted because of anthroposophy with the reality that it's not itself. It thinks it's itself in the most prideful way, but it's not who it is. It's not who really is there. But you've got this pregnant promise. You've got this pregnant moment of an incarnation in which to wake up here to who you truly are. Right? Well, that's anthroposophy to me. And then maybe maybe religions, this isn't a religion, but maybe religions help with this. Or maybe they just sustain, sometimes I think they do, they just sustain your salvation until you can come to a more self-aware, practical methodology that you need to have, that you're just going to need to have at some incarnational future. And I just got lucky, in my opinion, that I got it now. And what do you have? Well, literally, Kian, you have the method, the meditations and the spiritual exercises of Rudolf Steiner as, to me, the most conservative, the most difficult, the most morally careful exercises to refine, alchemically refine the lead of your soul into the gold of your true self, which is, I think, what alchemy always really was. I don't think it ever was changing metals and stuff. That was the degenerate forms of it. The original alchemy was always about what we're talking about right now. Rosicrucian alchemy was about transforming the lead of who you are into the gold of who you really are. Fair enough.
Okay.
We could go there. Okay.
But
Okay.
some of them definitely did believe that they were trying to transform matter as well, because I think that this is kind of the next step here, right? So within Rudolf Steiner's narrative, the way he says that, like, sacrifice is the ultimate principle, or one of the ultimate principles at work within evolution. And this can kind of connect to what we were saying about Chardin too. So with the evolution of the Earth, right? Like at one point, if you go all the way back to the earliest stages of Earth evolution, all of us, all of life, all of the different subtle bodies, all of these forces were just contained effectively within this one great sphere, as it were. Which within Kabbalah you would call that like Adam Kadmon, right? Like the primordial man.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
And then what happens over time here is that there's this diverging and differentiation that happens where that which is contained within the whole is kind of relinquished unto the offspring, right? And so you get the first developments of individualized biological organisms, and so the Adam Kadmon kind of loses a little bit of its animacy, and then it loses a little bit more over time as these different conditions for the possibility of the human are brought into being. And what's left over is you have this Earth that seems to be dead. It seems to be inanimate because it is, at every stage of this process, it's kind of rigidifying, becoming heavier, becoming more leaden, right?
Yeah.
And that's within alchemy and astrology and all that. Like Saturn is associated with lead, and Saturn is associated with with gravity, with conservatism, with inertia, with contraction, right? And as Steiner sees it, all that this process is one where there's this kind of divergence, right? There's something that carries forward because it's taking the torch and moving forward in evolutionary terms. But in order for that to happen, something else has to be left behind, which gives up that torch and says, okay, I'm just going to stay here and keep doing what I'm doing because I'm now part of the foundation. I'm part of the stage now, not one of the actors, as it were. And so I think what we're actually seeing here within alchemy, within this obsession with like transmuting lead into gold, what that actually was an intimation of the fact that the ultimate spiritual goal here is going to have to complete that sacrifice with redemption by spiritualizing the earth itself, like the literal physical body of the earth itself. And that is the redemption. That is what is going to complete, or how should I say, ameliorate that sacrifice. So
beautifully
can
said.
Can you use like mercury and weird phosphorus and stuff to turn like literal lead into gold? I'm not convinced you can, but archetypally here, that seems to be what that's gesturing towards. That as we continue to develop technologically, it's easy to see technology as evil, and in some ways, I think, if we're connecting it with like Ahriman, for example, it's easy to look at technology and be like, okay, this is cutting us off from the spiritual world. It's causing all of these problems. But again, I think we should look at that as like a scaffolding, like a ladder that we have to climb that maybe we can kick out from underneath us. Because eventually, what's going to need to happen here, I think, is that we're going to be developing this mastery over the earth that we're going to be able to use to actually spiritualize the earth rather than just turning it all into strip malls, right?
Yes. No, absolutely. That's beautifully said, actually, that spiritualization is, otherwise there's no Jupiter.
Right, right.
Yeah. Yeah. That kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and
That's
so
nice. That's go ahead.
I was going to segue into the Jupiter thing next. We can talk a little bit about that. I know we've been talking for a while, but let's say something about that since we brought it up. So, and you're going to have to take the mic, unfortunately, because I'm not entirely sure. I don't have a terribly clear conception of what this future Jupiter is supposed to be. So help me out with that.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. It really is. I mean, what are we doing right now? You could say the lowest level of Jupiter that will exist will be the plant kingdom. There will be no mineral kingdom anymore.
Mhm.
And then in Vulcan, I mean, in
Venus.
Venus, thank you. The lowest will be an animal. And then finally in Vulcan, we'd have the human would be the lowest in the whole thing, probably in some ways. So there's that. But there's there's a haunting lecture. It used to be called Man as Hieroglyph of the Universe, 1927, now I think it's called Harmony. I forgot the name. They changed the names on the darn books. Harmony of the Universe. It's not Man as Symphony of the Creative Word, which is one of the most beautiful titles of a Steiner lecture series, which is now called Harmony of the Universe. But it's the other one. The old title was Man as Hieroglyph of the Universe. Okay. So in the 15th and 16th lectures of that, Steiner wrestles with the contention that there's such a thing as a conservation of matter and energy. Yeah, that's sacrosanct. And Dale's like, right? He's saying, yes, that exists everywhere except for one place.
Agatha?
No, well, yes and no, right? In us. He says when a human being thinks, they actually annihilate matter.
Okay, and this is why I think you mentioned this in the Hermetics podcast that the brain is the only part that actually uses physical matter because he's seeing it
Right.
as fire. It is sacrificing
Yeah, I guess you could say, yeah.
physical matter to create light.
So in this process of thinking, we create images.
Yeah.
And that's what's left over from the complete destruction of matter, not energy. It doesn't turn into energy. It turns into images.
Mhm.
And because of the presence of Christ now after the mystery of Golgotha, this is very weird. Okay, everybody listening to this, I'm just saying what I remember, and it could have it a bit wrong, but I've wrestled and reread them trying to get this. He says these images are preserved by the Christ. All of them. And in the future Jupiter, they will build the Jupiter planet. So you and I, and all of humanity right now in our thinking process is actually annihilating the earth substance through our life of thinking. Let's say pure thinking, not just our passive. Let's go all the way to pure thinking, which he talks about in the Philosophy of Freedom. So it's already happening. So we're already doing it. The spiritualization you were talking about earlier is already kind of occurring.
Right.
And I don't know what happens like in technology. Is it going away? Because in some ways, maybe, he also talks about demonic forces being incarnated in technological invention.
Mm-hmm.
Da, 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 la, la. And those becoming a form of elemental beings on Jupiter that will really be problematic for humanity.
Right. And
et cetera, et cetera. So again, a very sloppy picture of it. I just wanted to bring these things up as hints and intimations. You'd have to read some of the Outline of Esoteric Science again, and then these lectures and stuff. But I don't have a really, truly concrete, solid picture. How much is solid? How much isn't solid on Jupiter? I don't think there's anything solid at all, but I don't know what that exactly even means, right? Is only the etheric the lowest level? I don't know. I don't know. So go ahead. I'm interrupting 3 times.
Oh, no, you're good. You're good. So the way I'm thinking of it is this: when Steiner says that the etheric will be the lowest level of future Jupiter, what I think he's saying is this. So the etheric is vital energies. It is the, again, it's what's there in the plants. It is this kind of mana, if you will, something like that. So if we're saying that the etheric is the lowest level, and that means you won't have a mineral kingdom per se, which I think is indicating this idea that the mineral body of the earth will be kind of raised up and it will become etherized. It will become living in a more substantial sense, even, and of course, the earth is not actually dead, but the mineral constituency of the earth will be kind of reanimated in a way. And so to connect this with the technology thing, machine technologies and computers, despite the mysticism surrounding them, are machines. Machines don't have an etheric body. They don't have vital forces. They can mimic that kind of thing if you put them together in nuanced enough ways and make them complicated enough. It can seem like there's living vitality there, genuine morphogenesis, but there's really not. But what this opens up then, I think, is the possibility of technology which is formative, not mechanical. And this is something I think that you see intimations of it here and there. You see it maybe a little bit in Tesla, maybe a little bit in this of like obscure plasma technology stuff, things with like bioelectricity and morphogenetic fields and all that. Like it's like the pieces are being put in place for the possibility of techniques, let's say, human artifice. I don't even know if you could call it artifice anymore, but human creativity, let's put it that way, to act upon the world at the level of the etheric rather than strictly at the level of physical, which is what modern technology is.
Yeah.
So if we can begin to do that, then we can begin to, then you don't just have a noosphere. It's like you could think of the noosphere as kind of like sinking into the earth, right? And we're kind of terraforming, as it were, the body of the earth into something that is more animate. And so what Steiner seems to be saying with the next phases here, again, you've got, if we look at Jungian individuation, separation, reintegration, right? So this is the reintegration, where eventually, once we get to Vulcan, there's not really going to be any differentiation anymore between the human and the earth. And so you're going to have kind of like a mirror image of ancient Saturn in a sense, because you've got this full reintegration which has happened. But the difference then is going to be that all the individuality that was created through this entire process of descent and ascent is still going to be there, but it's, instead of just being separate, it's going to be separate but also integrated. So that's my interpretation of that anyway.
You could call that the 10th hierarchy.
Yes, yeah.
That's Steiner says, the whole entire spiritual cosmos is sort of bent toward the earth, mothering humanity into another hierarchy of beings. So we are, as he says, the religion of the gods.
Right. Yeah, I love that.
That's just really, yeah.
Well, okay.
And I mean, we say this with all humility. People are going to think we're being highfalutin and we're such, the materialists and the people that are just wanting everything as it is to be as it is, think that that's some kind of highfalutin pridefulness. And it's really so shockingly the opposite of that, that it's precisely our pridefulness that makes this physical incarnation so special and so, I'm so wonderful. And it's really leavened, to me, balanced by Steiner trying to show us that, we're really kind of at the low point of it all. In a way, right? In a way, we're, are we going to wake up? Are we really going to be able because there's no guarantee. Are we going to be able to truly turn to the spiritual world again and begin to live into it authentically, not through some blind belief system of fear or whatever those things are motivated by, or tradition or whatever, but through awareness, through a scientific, objective understanding of our nature and our relationship to the cosmos.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let me try and say one last thing, and this is a thought that just occurred to me. So we're going to see whether I can spit it out correctly or not. You were talking about humility and hubris there, and you have this idea that's very prevalent. In fact, I would say it's almost foundational to modern science. This Copernican principle, this idea that we don't matter, that we're just
Yeah.
a speck in the ocean. And what's interesting about that, I think, is if you look at human psychology, when a child feels like they don't have a home, when they feel like their family doesn't care about them, what does that facilitate? It facilitates narcissism because it's like, well, nobody's looking out for me. I don't really matter. I mean, yeah, I can do whatever because I have to survive, and I'm the only one looking out for me. And it creates the very kind of narcissistic pathology which that kind of thinking thinks it's getting away from. And so it's exactly like you said, it masks itself as humility, but it's really not. It's actually doing the opposite, and it's actually facilitating this very luciferic kind of egotism that we now see in things like transhumanism and whatnot. And so if you flip that upside down then, and then you start saying, actually, maybe like we are here for a reason, and maybe the Earth kind of is the center, as it were, of this
Yeah.
much
Yeah.
bigger thing that's going on. Then it's like, oh, well, what I do actually does matter. And maybe it's not all just about, maybe I don't have to, do things that are morally uncouth just to get by. Maybe I actually do have an obligation to other people because they also have an obligation towards me. And so again, it's this kind of flip-flop thing where we think we're being humble by resigning ourselves to nihilism, when in reality we're facilitating the very narcissism that we're accusing religion and spirituality of being guilty of.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not accusing all of them of that at all, but yeah, no, it is a paradox as you describe it really before. These things are two sides of a very subtle coin, and I'm not going to sit here and say that, yeah, I'm not narcissistic. I'm not, I can't, there's no way I can say that, right? That kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is have you ever read Soren Kierkegaard
I
at all?
have tried a couple of times, and both times I was like, okay, I really need to go back to Hegel first before I'm going to get this. So
Yeah.
like I'm a
Yeah.
little familiar with his ideas, but not
Yeah.
that much for real.
Anyway, yeah, I was just thinking of some of his pictures of those things, but it's too far afield for now, but maybe some other time. Yeah.
All right. Well, on
Yeah.
that note, I guess we can go ahead and wrap this up then. Thank you so much for coming on here and chatting with me. That was a riveting conversation, I have to say.
I
Um,
sure enjoyed myself. Thank you so much.
Awesome. And yeah, it would be really great to do this again at some time in the future. And so I'll stay in touch if we
Yeah,
can
stay in
somehow make
touch.
something happen. Yeah. So
Sounds
again,
great.
nice to meet you as well. Yeah,
You
it's been
too.
great.
Very good.
Awesome.
Blessings, sir.